At 0210 hours local time, 3 Ukrainian long-range attack drones lifted off a camouflaged launch strip roughly 140 kilometers from their target, climbing just long enough to clear the tree line before dropping back down to barely 60 meters above the ground. From that altitude, hugging the contours of farmland and low ridgelines, they would stay invisible to almost every radar between the launch site and the coast, including, ironically, the one radar station whose entire job was to make sure nothing like this ever got close. The target sat on a stretch of high ground overlooking the western edge of the Crimean Peninsula, a long-range early warning radar complex built around a Nebo-M system, paired with a 96L6E all-altitude acquisition radar mounted on its own elevated platform. This wasn't a single dish quietly scanning the horizon. It was one of the key sensor nodes feeding the entire integrated air defense network protecting Crimea. The station that detected inbound threats early enough to hand targeting data down to the S-400 batteries and Buk-M3 systems that actually did the shooting. Take this site offline, even briefly, and every system downstream of it loses minutes of warning time it was never designed to operate without. The route itself had been planned for nearly 3 weeks before this single night, built around satellite imagery, captured terrain data, and a careful study of exactly where this radar station's elevation gave it the widest possible view of open sky and sea. And by definition, where that same elevation left the ground immediately around it harder to see. Every waypoint along the flight path had been chosen specifically to keep at least one ridgeline or fold of terrain between the airframes and the radar's main antenna for as long as physically possible, accepting a longer, slower route in exchange for staying invisible for an extra 20 kilometers. The crew operating the drones that night didn't need to destroy a warship, a bomber, or a fuel depot to make this a significant night's work. They needed 3 relatively small airframes, a flight path that stayed below the radar's effective detection floor for the entire approach, and roughly 4 minutes of uninterrupted final run once they crossed into the radar station's own close-in defensive perimeter. Everything about the mission had been built around a single piece of irony nobody on the Ukrainian side bothered to state out loud. The best way to blind an early warning station is to approach from exactly the angle its own radar geometry can't cover. On a spec sheet, the Nebo-M complex is an intimidating piece of equipment. Its associated radars can detect aircraft-sized targets at ranges well beyond 200 kilometers, track ballistic and cruise missile threats, and feed that data into a network designed to give Russian air defense crews minutes of advance warning before anything dangerous arrives. Against the threats it was designed around: high-altitude aircraft, fast-moving missiles, large radar cross-section targets approaching from open sky. That capability is real and well-earned, but every powerful, long-range search radar carries the same structural weakness, and it has nothing to do with how advanced its electronics are. A radar searching for targets dozens or hundreds of kilometers away optimizes its beam pattern, scan rate, and signal processing around exactly that kind of target. The closer a threat gets to the radar itself, and the lower it flies relative to the surrounding terrain, the more that same beam pattern works against the operator instead of for them. Most large search radars carry what crews privately call a cone of silence, a zone close to and almost directly beneath the antenna, where geometry, ground clutter, and the radar's own search pattern combine to make detection genuinely difficult. Sometimes for the same reason a lighthouse beam is nearly useless for illuminating the rocks directly beneath it. The terrain-masked approach Ukraine had planned didn't need to defeat the Nebo-M's headline detection range at all. It only needed to stay low enough and arrive from a direction shielded by enough intervening high ground to remain inside that blind cone for as long as possible, turning the station's own elevated position chosen specifically to maximize its view of the open sky and the sea beyond, into the very thing limiting its view of the ground immediately around it. At 0231 hours, with the drones now 30 kilometers out and still descending into the lowest terrain folds, the route allowed, the radar station's own screens showed exactly what they had shown for the previous several hours. Nothing worth flagging. This is not a flaw any single upgrade easily fixes, and that is precisely why it keeps getting exploited. Closing a radar's close-in blind cone usually means adding an entirely separate, shorter-range sensor system layered on top of the long-range one, with its own crew, its own power supply, and its own maintenance burden. A second piece of expensive equipment justified almost entirely by a threat that, for most of this radar's operational history, simply didn't exist. Air forces spent decades optimizing early warning radar for fast, high-altitude threats because that was the only threat worth optimizing against. Cheap, slow, low-flying drones rewired that calculation almost overnight, and most fixed installations built before this war are still running the sensor suite that calculation produced. What the radar's main search system missed, the station's close-in defenses were specifically positioned to catch instead. Unlike a single exposed sensor, a site this valuable to the broader air defense network came with its own dedicated protection. A Pantsir S-1 battery parked roughly 600 meters from the main antenna array, tasked with exactly one job: stopping anything that got close enough to threaten the radar itself, regardless of how it got there. At 0234 hours, the Pantsir S-1's own shorter-range tracking radar picked up the first genuinely solid contact of the night, at a range of just under 9 kilometers. This was the system working as intended. A Pantsir S-1's entire design philosophy is built around covering exactly this gap, protecting high-value, fixed assets like radar stations and missile batteries from low-altitude threats that slip past the area's longer-range sensors. Its crew didn't need 10 minutes of advance warning to do their job. They needed enough time to lock, launch, and intercept inside a much shorter, much more survivable window. Behind the Pantsir S-1, a smaller secondary layer waited in reserve, a two-man team with shoulder-fired, man-portable air defense missiles, positioned closer to the antenna array itself as a last resort backstop in case anything slipped past the main battery entirely. It was not a system anyone expected to actually use on a normal night. Its presence was an acknowledgement, built into the site's own defensive plan, that a single layer of protection, however capable, was never considered sufficient on its own for a node this valuable to the wider network. The crew brought the system to full readiness within 90 seconds, rotating the turret toward the bearing and beginning to track all three contacts as they separated into individual approach lanes roughly 7 kilometers out. On paper, this was close to the ideal scenario for a point defense system like the Pantsir S-1. Multiple small, slow targets detected with several minutes still on the clock, well inside the missile system's engagement envelope. If this had been a single drone approaching in a straight line, the engagement would likely have ended there, with one missile, one intercept, and a footnote in a maintenance log instead of a video like this one. The three drones had not stayed together for exactly this reason. Roughly 5 kilometers out, they split further, with one holding a steady, almost careless course directly toward the Pantsir S-1's own position, drawing the system's attention toward itself rather than the radar array it existed to protect, while the other two widened their separation and began weaving shallow course corrections every few seconds, just enough to break a clean, predictive track without ever fully losing the bearing toward their actual target. The Pantsir S-1's fire control radar is built to track multiple contacts simultaneously, and in a straightforward intercept scenario, that capability is more than sufficient. But simultaneously does not mean with equal priority and equal confidence. Every time one of the weaving contacts shifted heading, the system's tracking solution had to update, briefly increasing the uncertainty around exactly where that drone would be when an interceptor missile reached it. Every few seconds spent refining a solution against one erratic contact was time not spent, refining the solution against the other two. At 0237 hours, the battery fired its first interceptor at the contact heading directly toward its own position. The correct call by any reasonable threat prioritization logic, since a drone approaching the air defense system itself represented the most immediate danger to the personnel operating it. The missile found its target. One contact destroyed, cleanly and exactly as designed. It was also, as it turned out, the one airframe in the formation never intended to reach the radar array at all. With one contact down and two still inbound, now barely 2 kilometers out and descending into their final approach profile, the crew had less than 30 seconds to engage both remaining threats before they crossed into a range where a missile intercept would no longer guarantee the warhead detonated clear of the radar array itself. They fired a second interceptor, tracking the nearer of the two weaving contacts. It missed. Not because the missile malfunctioned, but because the contact had shifted heading just recently enough, that the firing solution was already several meters out of date by the time the missile reached the intercept point. At 0238 hours, the surviving drone struck the base of the 96L6E acquisition radar's elevated platform, detonating roughly 4 meters from the antenna's support structure. The blast wasn't large enough to level the entire installation, but it didn't need to be. It tore through the support legs, holding the rotating array more than a story above the ground, sending the antenna assembly crashing down across the platform in a shower of sparks and twisted steel, and severed the underground cabling routing power and data between the radar head and the operations bunker beneath it. 90 seconds later, the second surviving contact, the one that had spent the entire engagement weaving just enough to stay ahead of a clean firing solution, completed its approach against the secondary Nebo-M trailer, parked roughly 80 meters from the main array, designed as a backup sensor specifically so the site could keep operating if the primary radar went down. The explosion tore through the trailer's side panel and ignited the onboard generator fuel supply. And within minutes, the backup system that existed specifically to prevent exactly this scenario was burning alongside the system it was meant to replace. By 0240 hours, the early warning radar station that had spent years scanning 200 kilometers of open sky and sea could no longer reliably see 15 kilometers in any direction. The Pantsir S-1 battery that had successfully destroyed the first contact of the night remained fully operational, its crew unhurt, its tracking radar intact. It had done its job almost perfectly against 2 of 3 threats. It simply hadn't been built or positioned or given enough warning time to stop all 3. Damage control teams reached the antenna platform within minutes, but there was little left to salvage in the short term. The collapsed support structure had taken the main array down with it, and the severed cabling beneath the platform meant that even an intact replacement antenna would need new trenching and new wiring run before it could be reconnected to the operations bunker. What remained operational at the site by sunrise was a single short-range tracking radar attached to the Pantsir S-1 itself, enough to defend the immediate position, nowhere near enough to resume the station's actual job of watching the wider sky. The damage that mattered most that night wasn't visible from the ground at all. This station hadn't just been a sensor watching its own patch of sky. It had been feeding continuous tracking data into the broader integrated air defense picture covering western Crimea, giving S-400 and Buk-M3 batteries dozens of kilometers away the extra minutes of advance warning they needed to engage threats at maximum range before those threats ever got close enough for the battery's own shorter-range radars to pick them up unassisted. With this node gone, every system downstream lost a portion of its effective reaction time, not because their own equipment had failed, but because the early warning they depended on simply no longer existed for that sector. A Buk-M3 crew 30 kilometers away that previously had 4 or 5 minutes of advance notice, before an inbound aircraft entered their own radar's detection range, now had whatever fraction of that time their organic sensors could provide alone, often closing the gap between detection and required engagement to a window measured in seconds rather than minutes. This is the pattern that keeps showing up across this entire campaign, on land and at sea. The most strategically damaging strikes are rarely the ones that destroy the most visually dramatic target. They're the ones that remove a single node holding an entire network together, leaving every other system in that network technically intact, fully staffed and fully operational, and quietly less effective than it was the night before, because the thing that used to give it advance warning no longer exists. Picture the same Buk-M3 crew, 6 hours after this strike, with the sun up and air traffic over the Black Sea returning to its usual daytime pattern. A reconnaissance aircraft skirting the edge of Crimean airspace, the kind of flight this network used to flag the moment it entered detection range 200 kilometers out, now doesn't appear on anyone's screen until it's close enough for the Buk's own organic radar to pick it up directly, by which point the crew has a fraction of the decision time they had the day before, for a threat that hasn't changed at all. The aircraft hasn't gotten faster or stealthier. The network protecting against it has simply gotten shorter-sighted, one missing radar at a time. Militarily, Russia could accurately report that this engagement was, in part, a success. One inbound drone destroyed cleanly by a functioning point defense system. No personnel casualties reported. The site's perimeter defenses performing exactly as designed against the majority of the threat. Every one of those claims would hold up under scrutiny. None of them changed the fact that the station's actual purpose, extending the network's vision far enough out to give everything behind it room to react, had been removed from the picture in under 30 minutes. That is the deeper logic behind targeting an early warning site instead of the batteries it feeds. A single S-400 launcher destroyed is a single launcher Russia has to replace or do without. A single radar station blinded is a hole in the coverage map that every other system in that sector has to compensate for, every hour of every day, until repairs are complete or a replacement unit is brought up to take its place, and replacement long-range radar complexes are neither cheap nor quick to redeploy. Every minute that hole stays open is a minute the rest of Crimea's air defense network is operating with less warning than it was built around, against threats that haven't stopped arriving. This is also why these strikes tend to come in waves rather than as isolated incidents. Knocking out one early warning node forces a choice. Thin out coverage elsewhere to patch the gap, or accept reduced warning time across an entire sector until the damaged site comes back online. Either choice creates a new vulnerability somewhere else on the map, and a campaign built around finding exactly those new gaps doesn't need to win every single engagement to keep gaining ground. It only needs the gaps to keep opening up faster than they can be closed. There is a cost equation underneath this as well, and it rarely favors the side doing the defending. 3 long-range attack drones, even accounting for one loss to a successful intercept, represent a small fraction of what a single Nebo-M radar complex costs to build, transport, and bring back into service. Repairing or replacing a damaged long-range radar isn't a matter of swapping a part. It often means waiting months for a new array to be manufactured and shipped to a war zone, while the gap it leaves behind has to be covered somehow in the meantime. A campaign that keeps targeting these nodes specifically isn't just degrading a single network. It's making sure that every dollar spent rebuilding it costs more and takes longer than the strike that created the need for it in the first place. Thank you for watching until the end of this video. If you found this breakdown useful, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below. After watching how this early warning station's own blind spot was the thing that ultimately got it taken offline, do you think Russia will start hardening these sites with overlapping radar coverage? Or will the next wave of strikes find the same gap all over again? Let us know what you think, and thank you for supporting this channel.